Those flying rats are finally gone.
HOA President Vanessa waited until I left town, then sent exterminators onto my property to poison every bat inside my 120-year-old barn. By the time I got home, the barn was silent. Within days, wildlife investigators were pulling infrared footage that Vanessa never knew existed. What she also didn't know was that the barn housed a documented protected colony, and every second of her crew's visit had been recorded. If you like watching bullies get beaten by paperwork instead of fists, subscribe. Because the $450,000 notice was only the beginning. The deeper investigators dug, the worse it got for her. The first thing I noticed on the live feed wasn't Vanessa. It was the hose. A thick black line stretched from a white exterminator's van across my gravel driveway and disappeared through the side door of my barn. I was 3 counties away when the motion alert hit my phone. I opened the camera app and zoomed in. 2 men in disposable coveralls and respirators were moving equipment toward the building. One checked a clipboard while the other adjusted a machine beside the door. Vanessa stood about 10 feet behind them. Designer sunglasses. HOA folder tucked under one arm. No mask. No hesitation. She looked like she was supervising a landscaping crew. I called the number printed on the van. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. Then I switched to the infrared camera inside the loft. Normally, at that time of evening, the upper rafters were alive with small heat signatures. Dozens of them clustered beneath the beams, shifting as the temperature changed and sunset approached. That night, they started moving fast, then lower. Then some of them disappeared from the screen. I was too far away to stop what was happening. So I started recording. I saved the exterior camera, the driveway camera, the loft camera, every timestamp, every license plate I could read. Then Vanessa stepped close enough to one of the exterior microphones for me to hear her clearly. She looked toward the barn and said, "Maybe now he'll finally clean this place up." That sentence would matter later. A lot. For months, Vanessa had told everyone this was about safety, sanitation, property values. But standing on land she didn't own while chemicals were pumped into a building she had no authority over, she finally said what she really wanted. She wanted the barn gone. At that moment, she thought the only witness was me. She was wrong. Those cameras weren't installed because I was worried about Vanessa. They were installed because of the bats. And the people monitoring them were about to notice that an entire colony had suddenly gone quiet. That barn had been standing there long before Vanessa ever learned the letters HOA. My grandfather bought the property in 1958. My father kept the barn alive, one repair at a time. He replaced rotten boards, straightened the west wall, and reinforced the loft after a winter storm nearly took the roof off. When I was a kid, I followed him around carrying nails and whatever tool he told me not to drop. Years later, I became a historic restoration carpenter myself. So after my wife died and I finally retired, coming back to the property felt natural. The barn wasn't polished. The paint had faded. Some of the siding was older than I was, but every beam in that building had a memory attached to it. Then the subdivision arrived. Luxury houses went up along the eastern side of my land. Stone entrance monuments followed. Decorative streetlights. Perfect lawns. Then the HOA. And eventually, Vanessa. My parcel was never part of the association. That detail bothered Vanessa more than anything else. Her first letter said the barn violated community aesthetic standards. The next one called it a visual blight. Then came complaints about my fencing, the roof color, weeds near the boundary. Even where I parked my old pickup, I answered each notice the same way. I sent a copy of my deed and the county parcel map. I highlighted the property line. My land ended exactly where her authority did. One afternoon, Vanessa cornered me outside a community meeting. "You may not technically be in the association, Ethan," she said, "but everyone around you has to look at that building." I told her, "Your bylaws stop at my property line." She smiled, not because she found it funny, because she took it personally. After that, the letters changed. She stopped talking about paint, stopped talking about siding, and started talking about the bats. Suddenly, the barn wasn't just ugly. According to Vanessa, it was a public health threat. That was when I realized she wasn't looking for a way to improve my property. She was looking for a reason to get inside it. The bats had been there longer than the subdivision, too. I first noticed the size of the colony 3 summers earlier, when they started slipping through a gap beneath the north eave after sunset. There were too many to ignore. So I called the state wildlife office. That was how I met Dr. Mara Ellison. Mara spent 2 evenings documenting the colony before explaining that the barn had become an important seasonal roost. Her team installed infrared cameras in the loft, temperature sensors near the beams, a counter at the primary exit. From that point on, the barn wasn't only being watched by me, it was being monitored. Mara showed me which parts of the loft I could repair and which areas I needed to leave alone. I followed every recommendation. I even postponed part of a roof replacement, because disturbing the animals at the wrong point in the season could do serious damage. Vanessa knew wildlife professionals were involved. There was a monitoring notice beside the barn door. She had seen Mara's vehicle on my property more than once. One afternoon, she pointed toward the sign and laughed. "You're protecting bats now." "I'm protecting what lives on my property," I said. She rolled her eyes. To Vanessa, they were still flying rats. But those monitoring systems were about to turn her simple pest removal into something she couldn't explain away. The cameras showed the colony behaving normally before the exterminators arrived. They showed the crew entering. They showed when the fog reached the loft, and afterward they showed the activity collapsing. There was something even worse for Vanessa. Months before any chemicals entered that barn, I had warned her in writing not to touch it. The first serious notice arrived about 4 months before the fumigation. The heading read, "Wildlife Nuisance and Public Health Concern." Vanessa claimed residents had complained about bats crossing into neighboring yards. The letter said the board was considering emergency remediation if I failed to address the problem. I read it twice. Then I answered carefully. I attached my deed, the county parcel map, and the wildlife monitoring information Mara had given me. Then I wrote, "My property is not part of your HOA. You have no easement or authority to enter it. The barn contains a monitored, protected bat colony. Do not enter the structure, hire anyone to disturb it, or attempt wildlife removal without contacting me and the appropriate wildlife authorities." I sent it by email. Then I mailed a certified copy. Vanessa responded, 23 minutes later. No attorney, no wildlife specialist, just Vanessa. "Your bats are not going to hold this neighborhood hostage." I printed the message and filed it. At the time, I treated it like another angry HOA email. A few weeks later, one of the quieter board members caught me outside the hardware store. He looked uncomfortable.
"Vanessa's been calling pest control companies."
I asked why. He shrugged. She thinks if the bats disappear, you'll lose your reason for keeping the barn the way it is. That was the first time I realized she might actually try something. I sent one final message. No argument. No threats. One sentence. You do not have permission to enter my property. She never replied. 3 days later, an old friend of mine died. I left town for his funeral. Vanessa knew I was gone, and the next motion alert I received came from an exterminator's van turning into my driveway. I got home just before sunset the following day. Normally, that was when the barn came alive. You could stand near the fence and hear faint movement above the loft. Then the first bats would slip from beneath the eaves as the light faded. That evening there was nothing. No movement. No sound. Just a chemical smell hanging around the side door. I stopped before touching the handle and called Mara. She arrived about 40 minutes later carrying gloves, respirators, sample bags, and an expression I had never seen on her face before. "Don't go inside yet," she said. We started outside. Fresh tire marks crossed the gravel. There were scratches around the latch. Inside, the sharp odor was still there. Mara moved slowly through the loft, while I followed several steps behind. Then her flashlight stopped. There were bats on the floor beneath the rafters, some near the wall, others beneath the roosting boxes her team had installed. My first instinct was to pick one up. Mara caught my arm. "Don't touch anything." She scanned the loft. "This isn't cleanup anymore, Ethan. It's evidence." That changed everything. We photographed the doorway. Residue. Marks left by equipment. The ventilation panels. The floor. Nothing moved until it had been documented. Then Mara opened the monitoring system. The data was almost worse than seeing the loft. Before the exterminator arrived, activity looked normal. Temperatures were stable. Movement was steady. Then the workers entered. The fog reached the upper structure. Within minutes, the activity graph collapsed. Mara copied the original monitoring files onto separate drives. One stayed with her. One stayed with me. I went downstairs and sat on the workbench my father had built when I was 16. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Vanessa had spent months calling that building worthless. Old wood, bad paint, flying rats. But she had never understood what she was actually destroying. Finally, Mara said, "I need to make some calls." I nodded. That was when I knew the situation had moved beyond an argument with an HOA president. Vanessa apparently hadn't figured that out yet. Because the next morning, I opened my mailbox and found an envelope from the HOA. They weren't apologizing. They were billing me. The notice was titled, "Emergency Wildlife Nuisance Abatement." They had itemized everything: extermination fee, administrative fee, inspection fee, and at the bottom, a demand that I reimburse the association for protecting neighboring residents from what they called a hazardous wildlife condition. I read it twice. They had entered my property without permission, destroyed part of a monitored colony, and now they wanted me to pay for it. For about a minute, I considered driving straight to Vanessa's house. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table and opened a new folder. I sent the HOA a written request for 6 things: the exterminator's name, the chemical used, the invoice, the person who authorized the job, the insurance information, and the legal authority Vanessa believed allowed the HOA to enter my land. Her answer came that afternoon. "The board does not answer to non-members." That line actually helped me. I printed it, dated it, filed it. Then Mara called. Her voice was more formal than before. "Ethan, I need the original camera files, not copies. I asked why. She paused. Because this is no longer just a property dispute. I sent everything. Exterior footage, loft footage, monitoring data, my correspondence with Vanessa, the certified letter. The HOA bill. Within days, wildlife investigators were reviewing the package. When one of them called me, he wasn't interested in whether Vanessa had been rude. He wanted timestamps, authorization records, chemical information, and one very specific answer. Who told the exterminator they had permission to enter my barn? I didn't know yet, but somewhere inside the HOA's paperwork that name was already written down. The investigators didn't begin by confronting Vanessa. They started with the exterminator. That turned out to be smart. The company handed over its work order, invoice, emails, and the name of the person who booked the job. The customer wasn't me. It was the HOA. Under authorized contact was one name, Vanessa Crane. The contractor said they had been told the association had authority to deal with a dangerous infestation. Then they produced an email that made the entire timeline worse. Vanessa had written, "The owner is difficult. Schedule the work while he's away so we can avoid unnecessary confrontation." So the timing wasn't accidental. She had waited for me to leave. The contractor also claimed they had been told I had already been notified and that the HOA was acting under emergency authority. I had never approved anything. My deed showed that. My certified warning showed that. And my own driveway camera showed Vanessa standing on my property while the crew went inside. Investigators began building the timeline. My warning. Vanessa's response. Her search for an exterminator. My departure for the funeral. The contractor entering the property. The chemical application. The collapse in monitoring activity. Then the bill Vanessa sent me afterward. Every document led naturally to the next one. And Vanessa had created most of the paper trail herself. A few days later, an investigator sat across from me at my kitchen table. My binder was open between us. He asked, "Did Ms. Crane know this colony was being monitored before she authorized the work?" "Yes." "Did you tell her in writing?" "Yes." I pulled out the certified letter. Then the email thread. He read my warning first, then Vanessa's response. His eyes stopped on one sentence. "Your bats are not going to hold this neighborhood hostage." He read it again, then looked at me. "Do you have the original version of this email?" I pointed toward my computer. Every message, every attachment, every timestamp. That was the moment the investigation changed. Until then, Vanessa could still argue she had made a terrible mistake. Now investigators had to consider something worse. What if she knew exactly what she was doing? While they were asking that question, Vanessa called an emergency HOA meeting to tell the neighborhood her version of events. She opened the meeting with a smile. Not a nervous smile. The same polished expression she used whenever she wanted a bad decision to sound official. Nearly 40 homeowners were there. Vanessa told them the board had acted in good faith to address an immediate health concern. Then she blamed the exterminator. According to Vanessa, the contractor had misunderstood the situation. No one on the board knew the bats were protected. No one intended to harm wildlife, and I had supposedly been uncooperative throughout the process. I sat in the back. I said nothing. Then one board member raised his hand. "Did we have permission to go onto Ethan's property?" Vanessa paused. "We believed emergency conditions allowed us to act." "That's not what I asked." The room changed. Then the treasurer spoke. "Did you tell the contractor Ethan had approved the work?" Vanessa looked down at her notes. "I don't recall the exact wording." That answer didn't survive very long. Investigators had already obtained the relevant HOA emails. Inside them was my original warning. "Do not enter or disturb the barn. It contains a monitored, protected bat colony." Directly beneath it, "Your bats are not going to hold this neighborhood hostage." But there was another email. This one had gone to the exterminator. Vanessa wrote, "I don't care what he calls them. They're pests. Make sure they don't come back." That destroyed the misunderstanding defense. She knew there was a monitored colony. She knew I had denied permission. And she moved ahead anyway. 3 days later, every homeowner received another notice. This one didn't mention property values. It didn't mention pests. The heading said, "Emergency Board Meeting, Mandatory Financial Disclosure." When I walked into the community room that night, there was a thick packet in front of every board member. Vanessa was already sitting at the table. She looked pale. The treasurer didn't start with her. He started with the number. He turned the packet around. At the bottom of the first page, boxed in black, was the projected financial exposure, $450,000. For the first time since I had known her, Vanessa didn't reach for the microphone. She just stared at the page. The room was so quiet, I could hear someone shifting in a folding chair behind me. The treasurer cleared his throat. "This includes potential penalties, habitat remediation, monitoring, professional cleanup, legal expenses, and compliance costs associated with the fumigation." Vanessa finally looked up. "What exactly is that number?" No one answered immediately. One board member flipped through the packet. Another removed his glasses. Then the treasurer looked directly at Vanessa. "This is what your pest problem may cost us." A murmur moved through the room. Vanessa straightened in her chair. "We acted on information provided by the contractor." The treasurer shook his head. "No, the contractor acted on information provided by us." That landed harder. Vanessa tried again. "We didn't know those bats were protected." I opened my binder, pulled out one sheet of paper, and handed it to the board member closest to me. He read it, then passed it down the table. My warning was at the top. "The barn contains a monitored, protected bat colony. Do not enter or disturb the structure." Below it was Vanessa's response. "Your bats are not going to hold this neighborhood hostage." The page stopped in front of the treasurer. He looked at her. "You wrote this?" Vanessa said nothing. A woman in the second row spoke. "You knew?" Vanessa looked toward the homeowners. "I knew Ethan claimed they were protected. That is not the same thing as—" The board secretary interrupted her. "There's another email." She turned several pages, then read it aloud. "I don't care what he calls them. They're pests. Make sure they don't come back." Nobody moved. Vanessa's face changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was the look of someone who had finally realized that every explanation she had prepared depended on one thing: nobody being able to prove she knew. Now her own words were sitting on the table. One board member leaned back. "Oh my God." The treasurer closed the packet. "We need independent counsel, and effective immediately. You are not authorizing anything on behalf of this association." Vanessa looked around the table. Nobody defended her. Not the secretary. Not the treasurer. Not the board members who had sided with her for years. The entire board went silent. I thought I would feel triumphant. I didn't. because $450,000 couldn't restore what had died in that loft. Watching Vanessa lose control of a room wasn't the ending I wanted. The barn was still quiet. That was the part I wanted fixed. Then, a few weeks later, Mara called me on a Tuesday evening. "There's still activity," she said. "Not much, but enough." A small group had survived by roosting deeper in an untreated section near the stone foundation. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than anger. We got to work. Contaminated areas were professionally cleaned. Damaged roosting boxes were replaced. Cracks near the upper rafters were repaired without sealing the surviving bats out. The monitoring system went back online. This time we added more cameras, and beside the barn door, we installed a much larger sign. Monitored wildlife habitat, no unauthorized entry. The HOA changed too. Vanessa resigned as president. The new board adopted rules requiring documented permission before contractors could enter property outside the association. Environmental complaints had to go through the proper authorities. And no single board member could authorize another so-called emergency operation alone. A few neighbors came over to help repair the fence. Some apologized. I accepted. I didn't need them to hate Vanessa. I needed them to understand how quickly a little authority becomes dangerous when nobody questions it. Months passed. Then one evening, Mara and I stood outside the barn watching the monitor. The counter changed. 1, then 3, then 11. A teenager from the subdivision was standing near the fence with his father. "Are they coming back?" he asked. I looked toward the roof. "If we leave them something worth coming home to." Right then, one bat slipped beneath the eave. Then another. Then dozens. Within minutes, the sky above the barn was moving again. I thought about the $450,000 notice. The emails, the meetings, Vanessa losing the room she once controlled. None of it felt as important as what I was watching. She had called them pests. She had called my barn an eyesore. And she had convinced herself that a title on an HOA board gave her the right to decide what belonged on someone else's land. In the end, she lost that title. The barn was still standing, and the bats came home. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying what someone else built. It's making sure they fail to destroy what was never theirs. And if an HOA entered your property, poisoned protected wildlife, then sent you the bill for doing it, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments.